The room was packed, shoulder to shoulder, with people who had no idea they were about to witness something unforgettable. The air felt heavy, as if holding its breath. Not a single voice rose above a whisper. The only sounds were the soft creak of wooden benches. A cough here and there. The rustling of paper beneath nervous fingers. Eyes darted, heads turned toward the front of the room. Everyone waiting, not quite sure what for, but knowing something was coming. And then, like a ripple through still water, she stood up, a 12-year-old girl, tiny in frame, her black curls tied back in a loose ponytail, a simple blue dress brushing just past her knees. Her shoes made barely a sound as she stepped into the aisle. But somehow her presence rang louder than any voice had that day. Clutched tightly against her chest was a small leather notebook, worn at the edges, loved like a secret. Her name was Layla Johnson, and for a flickering moment, some in the room wondered if she had gotten lost, if a child like her truly belonged among a room full of adults discussing serious matters. But her eyes silenced the doubt. There was nothing childish in them. They held a calm beyond her years, a clarity that didn't waver. And as she made her way slowly toward the front, people turned, their whispers fading into stunned silence. Some blinked in confusion, others exchanged uncertain glances. A few sat up straighter, as if bracing for something unexpected. But Layla didn't glance back. She didn't fidget or falter. With every step, the air thickened, not with tension now, but with awe. She stopped at the front, took one slow breath, and raised her voice, not loud, but clear as morning light cutting through mist, and said, "Justice doesn't care what color you are. I'm only here to remind you of that." And in that instant, the room fell completely still. Not the polite kind of silence, but the kind that arrives when truth is spoken in a place where it wasn't expected. It wasn't just the words, it was the weight of who they came from. A girl who looked like she should be drawing in a classroom, not standing in the center of a storm. And yet, here she was, holding up not just a notebook, but a mirror, the kind that doesn't lie. And what they saw in that moment, what they heard in that small voice, wasn't a child, it was a reckoning. Layla didn't yell, she didn't demand, she reminded, and the reminder was simple, undeniable, and devastating in its honesty. Justice does not have an age, a size, or a face. It only asks that someone be brave enough to speak. That day, Layla Johnson did just that. And nothing in the room would ever be the same. The Johnson house wasn't grand or polished, but it pulsed with something far more precious, warmth. It was a place where mornings smelled like toast and cinnamon tea, where laughter lingered in the corners, where the television murmured quietly in the evenings while books lay open and crayons rolled under tables. Angela Johnson, the mother, was the heartbeat of it all, a woman whose gentleness was steady and firm, who held the family together not with loud words but with quiet resilience. She raised her daughters to be kind, to be curious, to carry their identities like light, not weight. And though she worked too hard, sometimes so tired she could barely stand, she never let her daughters see it. Kira, the older sister, was 15 and shone with the kind of boldness that turned heads. A varsity basketball player, an honor roll student, a girl who remembered the janitor's name and walked her little sister home every afternoon. To Layla, Kira wasn't just a sibling, she was a compass. And Layla, quiet and thoughtful, was her own kind of bright, always curled up with a book too big for her, scribbling in her notebook, saying little but meaning everything when she did. That Thursday morning began like any other, with backpacks zipped, grins exchanged, and the usual promise from Kira that she'd help with dinner. Angela kissed her daughter's forehead, and Layla gave her the customary hug from behind. Nothing felt out of place, until the phone rang. Angela, mid-laundry, answered it with the usual warm politeness. But something shifted in her face almost immediately. Her smile vanished, her knees buckled ever so slightly, and she sank into the nearest chair as if the ground beneath her had gone soft. Layla, coloring quietly at the kitchen table, froze. Her mother didn't speak, just listened with wide, stunned eyes. When she finally hung up, the silence that followed was deafening. "She's been suspended," Angela said, her voice hollow. "She's being accused of stealing." Layla blinked, confused. "Who?" But Angela didn't answer right away. Her gaze was locked somewhere across the room, distant and fragile. "Kira," she whispered. "They think Kira took another student's phone." The air cracked. Reality fractured. The home that felt so safe just moments before now trembled under a truth that made no sense. Angela reached for her keys with shaking hands, but stopped, paralyzed by disbelief. Layla sat still, her small hands trembling beneath the table. How could something like this happen? How could Kira, the most honest person she knew, be seen as a thief? The school called it a misunderstanding, said they were following protocol. But to Angela and her daughters, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like something deeper. A white student had misplaced her phone after gym and casually mentioned seeing Kira near her locker. No witnesses, no evidence, just a whisper, but that whisper was enough. Kira was pulled from class that same day, interrogated alone, sent home with a suspension notice stapled to a folded letter that read pending further investigation. Angela raced to the school, her grip on the steering wheel white-knuckled and desperate. But the front desk told her coldly that it was too late, and she'd need to schedule a formal meeting. The next morning, Kira's name wasn't in a file, it was on the school bulletin. Hidden in legal terms but understood by everyone. Her phone fell silent, her coach benched her, her summer leadership application was quietly removed. And just like that, the bright, confident girl who lit up hallways was now a shadow, whispers trailing her, eyes avoiding her, lockers slamming louder when she passed. Layla watched it all unfold, not as a sudden crash, but a slow, painful crumbling. Her sister was being erased, piece by piece, moment by moment, and no one seemed to care enough to ask why. That night, their shared bedroom was wrapped in stillness, the kind that doesn't soothe but stings. The curtains were drawn tight, the lights left off as though even brightness might hurt. Kira sat on the edge of her bed, knees to her chest, a fortress of silence built around her. Layla entered quietly, settling beside her without a word, unsure if comfort had a language strong enough for this. The silence stretched, not heavy with absence but full with everything that hadn't been said. Finally, Kira's voice, low and brittle, broke through. "They didn't even ask me what happened. They didn't even try." The pain wasn't just in the words, it was in the way they barely left her mouth. As if they'd been strangled by disbelief. Layla swallowed hard, the knot in her throat tightening. "They will," she whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong." But Kira just shook her head slowly, her eyes glossy with a sorrow that felt far too old for a 15-year-old girl. "They don't care, Layla. I'm not one of their kids. To them, I'm just a problem to handle." She turned toward her sister, her voice quieter still, almost afraid of its own truth. "They treat me like this just because of our skin." And in that moment, the words, though whispered, crashed through Layla like a thunderclap. It wasn't that she hadn't noticed before, the off glances, the tight-lipped smiles from teachers that didn't reach their eyes, but hearing it out loud, hearing it from Kira, made something crack open inside her. It didn't feel like sadness, it felt like the edge of understanding. Raw and rising. For the first time, Layla realized something so bitter and clear. Being good wasn't always enough. And being right didn't always mean protection. Not when the very system you trust is built to doubt you first. Beneath the ache in her chest, something else began to stir, quiet, fragile, but growing. Not anger, not yet. It was a question, small and persistent. What gave them the right? What gave them the right to decide guilt without evidence? To turn a girl with dreams and dignity into a threat? Angela Johnson, the mother who always taught grace before judgment, patience before anger, felt it too. She wasn't the kind of woman to raise her voice. Her power was quiet, steady, composed, but on Monday morning, her hands trembled as they gripped the steering wheel. Kira had refused to come. Layla sat beside her mother, silent, backpack clutched to her chest like armor. Angela had called ahead twice, but received no answer, so now they were walking in cold, hoping that somewhere inside that building, someone would choose to listen. They didn't. The receptionist gave a tight smile and led him down a hallway that felt colder than the rest of the school. When they arrived at the principal's office, Mr. Rayburn didn't look up, didn't invite him to sit. He reviewed the case with clinical detachment, never lifting his eyes from the paper. Angela asked for a conversation, pleaded for fairness, but the words bounced off the walls like echoes no one wanted to hear. She had the opportunity, Rayburn said. She chose to be uncooperative. And just like that, the door closed, not literally, but in every other way that mattered. They weren't speaking to people anymore. They were speaking to a wall built out of doubt, policy, and quiet prejudice. And Layla, watching her mother shrink, not in stature, but in spirit, understood something else. This wasn't just about her sister anymore. This was about being seen. This was about being heard. And they weren't, not yet. The walk back down that hallway should have felt like relief, an escape from a place that had offered nothing but dismissal. But it didn't. It felt like retreat, like surrender. Angela held Layla's hand tightly, moving quickly, eyes fixed ahead as if trying to outrun what had just happened. But halfway to the door, her steps slowed, her grip loosened, and without warning, she stopped. The noise of the hallway buzzed around them, students chatting, lockers clanging, teachers passing with papers and coffee cups, but for Angela Johnson, the world narrowed to one unbearable moment. She brought a hand to her mouth, not to stifle words, but to contain the sob rising up through her chest. And then, there in the middle of a crowded school hallway, the woman who never raised her voice, who never let her daughters see her falter, cried, not loudly, not theatrically, but in a way that was undeniably real, undeniably human. Her shoulders shook in silence. And beside her, Layla stood frozen. She didn't know how to hold her mother together when she herself felt like she was unraveling. No one stopped. No one asked. People walked around them, past them, like they were invisible. That, perhaps, hurt most of all. Layla had seen sadness before, in books, in movies, sometimes in her own quiet moments, but this was something different. This was erasure. Her mother wasn't just in pain, she was being unseen, not by her daughters, but by the system, by the people who had power and chose to look away. And in that instant, something sharp and permanent embedded itself in Layla's heart. They weren't just being overlooked, they were being unmade. Piece by piece, stripped of voice, of dignity, of the simple decency of being heard. On the drive home, Angela wiped her tears before they reached the driveway, pasting on a smile like armor, pretending nothing had happened. But Layla had seen everything. She'd seen her mother break. She'd felt it in the way her hand trembled on the gearshift, in the way her voice shook when she asked Layla about homework like it mattered right now. And that night, as leftovers warmed in the microwave and Kira stayed locked in her room, Layla sat on her bed, notebook open in her lap. But she didn't draw stars or write poems like she usually did. Instead, with hands still trembling and heart still burning, she wrote one word at the top of the page: justice. She didn't know everything that word meant, not yet. But she knew what it didn't look like. It didn't look like her sister being punished for someone else's assumption. It didn't look like her mother being dismissed for asking questions. And it didn't sound like silence in the face of cruelty. The next day, while other kids spilled onto the playground, Layla slipped into the library. It smelled like old carpet and warm sunlight. And she wandered past the picture books and magazines to the far back shelves, the ones filled with books no one ever checked out. Thick volumes with dense words: due process, civil rights, discrimination. She didn't understand it all. But she copied, underlined, reread. She stayed until the lights flickered for closing. Because now, she wasn't just trying to comfort her sister. She was trying to understand the rules of a game she never asked to play, one that wasn't fair to begin with. And somewhere deep down, a truth was beginning to form. If no one else would fight for Kira, maybe she would. It began quietly, without a plan, without anyone telling her what to do, just a feeling that wouldn't leave. A need to understand what no one was explaining. Every afternoon after school, while her classmates ran to the swings or sat under trees scrolling through their phones, Layla slipped into the library like a shadow. The carpet smelled of dust and old stories, and the air was always a little too still, a little too quiet, the way sacred places often are. She walked past the cheerful fiction shelves and shiny magazine racks, past the colorful posters of recommended reads, and found herself in the forgotten corner, where thick legal volumes gathered dust and time. The words didn't come easily. Phrases like due process, Title VI, civil liberties, all blurred together in stiff, unfamiliar language, but she kept reading, underlining, scribbling questions in the margins of her notebook, not because someone told her to, but because her heart wouldn't rest until it made sense. On the third day, Mr. Roberts noticed her. He wasn't flashy like the younger teachers, didn't raise his voice or fill the room with big performances, but he taught civics like it mattered, like it was alive. When he crouched beside her, gently asking if she was studying for something, Layla hesitated, half closing her notebook like it held a secret too delicate to share. Just trying to understand, she said softly, and that was enough. He didn't press her for answers. Instead, he walked away and returned minutes later with a quiet kindness that felt like sunlight through thick clouds, a small stack of handouts. A printout of the U.S. Constitution in large, clear letters, and a soft smile that said, "Keep going." He told her to start with the 14th Amendment, then Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. "You've got better questions than most adults I know," he said gently, sliding the papers across the table. "Keep asking them." And from that moment on, Layla wasn't just learning, she was searching, collecting, preparing. Her quiet trips to the library became routine, her notebook thick with notes, cases, and questions no one else seemed to be asking. She didn't have a podium or a stage. She wasn't looking for attention or applause. She just needed to understand why the rules that were supposed to protect people like her sister had failed to do so, and what could be done to make it right. She read about landmark cases, about bias in school discipline, about how systems designed to ensure safety could be turned into weapons when wielded by people who didn't believe in your worth. She wrote in the margins late into the night, eyes straining under a dim desk lamp, every page a quiet rebellion against injustice. She wasn't rehearsing a speech. She wasn't even planning to speak. But with every word she copied, every truth she underlined, Layla was building something within herself, a foundation of courage, of clarity, of voice. Not loud, not angry, but unshakable, and deep down, she knew, the adults weren't playing fair. The system wasn't built for girls like Kira. And if no one else would stand up, maybe, just maybe, she would. Not because she was brave. Not yet. But because staying quiet hurt more than speaking ever could. It didn't matter that she was 12. It didn't matter that her shoes barely made a sound in those long hallways. What mattered was that something in her refused to let go of the truth. And in that silence, in those pages, in that library no one visited, a voice was growing strong enough to be heard. The hearing room wasn't a courtroom. Not officially, but it carried the same weight, the same cold symmetry of chairs in precise rows. The same raised platform where power sat high above everyone else. Papers stacked like shields in front of each board member. Pens poised like swords. On one side sat the principal and the school counselor, faces stiff with practiced neutrality. On the other side, the Johnson family, 3 chairs that suddenly felt too small, too exposed, and far too quiet. Layla sat between her mother and her sister, her feet not quite reaching the ground, her hands clutching her notebook so tightly that its corners had bent under pressure. She hadn't planned to speak. That role belonged to her mother, who had spent nights pacing, rehearsing her words over and over, trying to fit her heartbreak into polite sentences. Kira had barely said a word all week, her body present but her spirit dulled, eyes fixated on the floor as if she could disappear into it if she just stared hard enough. Around them, people kept filing in, parents from the PTA, A few teachers who came out of curiosity. Even the girl who'd accused Kira of stealing. Sitting with her father in a crisp business suit. Arms folded, eyes scanning the room like a hawk waiting to pounce. When the session began, the air shifted instantly. The board chair, a tall man with a smooth, tired voice, welcomed everyone and laid out the rules. The time limits, the formality. Then, Principal Rayburn stood and read from a script that felt mechanical, detached. He spoke of events and procedures, of policies and precedents, describing Kira as non-compliant and the need to maintain a safe school environment. There was no mention of her name, no acknowledgement of her as a person, just a series of phrases meant to sound official, meant to justify. Then came the so-called evidence, a blurry hallway camera image showing Kira near the locker, a vague comment from a staff member who said she looked agitated, and worst of all, a form signed by the assistant principal noting that Kira refused to deny the accusation. Not a confession, not a confirmation, just silence, weaponized into guilt. When Angela rose to speak, her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she pleaded, not for pity, not for exemption, but for fairness. She spoke of her daughter's years of hard work, of the pain this had caused, of the dignity being stripped away from someone who had done nothing wrong. "I'm not asking you to protect her because she's my child," she said, voice cracking. "I'm asking you to stop punishing her because you assume she's guilty." But the board barely moved. One nodded politely. Another sipped from a bottle. Their faces unreadable, their eyes distant. It was clear their decision had been made long before the room had even filled. And as Layla looked around, as her heart pounded and her breath caught, she saw it all with perfect, painful clarity. This wasn't about justice. This was about control, about adults who had titles but not truth, power but no presence. Kira leaned in and whispered, "Let's just go. They're not going to listen." And maybe that would have been true, if not for what came next. Layla's grip on her notebook tightened. Her eyes flicked to the board, then to the crowd, and something in her, something quiet and determined, began to rise. "Excuse me." The words were barely above a whisper, but in a room so heavy with silence and finality, they rang out like a bell, slicing clean through the stillness. Every head turned, eyes widened. Angela's hand froze mid-grip on her purse strap, and Kira's breath hitched as she leaned in urgently. "Layla, don't," but it was too late. Layla Johnson, 12 years old, small enough that her feet barely brushed the floor when she sat, had already risen. Her notebook was pressed tightly to her chest. Her shoes made only the faintest tap on the tile, but her presence carried more weight than anything that had been said all afternoon. She didn't walk quickly, didn't speak loudly, she just moved forward like she was following a line only she could see. The board chair blinked in surprise, mouth opening to object, but her voice came first, soft. "Yes, but steady. I know I'm not supposed to speak. I'm just a kid, but I've been listening, and I need to say something before you decide what's fair." No one moved, no one interrupted. She opened her notebook, not to read, but to gather strength, and when she lifted her eyes again, something in him had changed. "You keep talking about policy," she said, her voice clearer now, steadier with each word, "about following procedures. But what about truth?" She turned slightly, addressing not just the board now, but everyone, the teachers, the parents, even the girl who had accused Kira. "What happened to my sister isn't just about a missing phone. It's about how fast you believed she could do something wrong. How easily you saw her as a suspect instead of a student." One of the board members shifted. Uncomfortable. Layla held her ground. "I've been reading. I read Title V of the Civil Rights Act. It says schools that get public money aren't allowed to discriminate. I read Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court said, separate isn't equal. But treating someone like they're dangerous just because of how they look, that's a kind of separation." Two murmurs rippled from the back. People leaned forward. Layla flipped the page. "I read about bias, how black students get suspended more than white students for the same things. I don't think you meant to be unfair. But that doesn't make this right." Her voice cracked slightly but didn't falter. "You say Kira didn't deny it, but she was scared. I would be, too, if no one believed me. If I knew that whatever I said, you'd already made up your minds." Her gaze flicked to her sister, then to her mother, both frozen, both transformed by something between heartbreak and pride. Then back to the board. "You don't have to admit you were wrong, but you can still make it right." And with those words, the room changed, not in volume, not in motion, but in weight. Something shifted. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full, thick with realization, with a truth that no one could unhear. She stepped back slowly, breath rising and falling, the notebook still in her hands. Her heart still pounding. She hadn't planned to speak. She hadn't even known if she could. But she had, and somehow, in that quiet, in that moment, Layla knew someone was finally listening. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Layla stood there, notebook clutched tightly in her hands, her words still hovering in the air like mist after a storm. Every eye was on her, some wide with disbelief, others softened with awe, but she didn't shrink beneath their gaze. She seemed to grow, and then, as if remembering something that had been waiting quietly in her backpack, she reached into the side pocket and pulled out a small silver voice recorder. Angela's breath caught audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. And Kira sat up straighter, eyes locked on her little sister with a mix of fear and wonder. Layla looked down at the recorder, her thumb hovering for a brief moment as the weight of what she was about to do settled on her shoulders. Then she lifted her chin, gaze locked on the board chair, and said clearly, "I didn't want to believe it at first, but I needed to know for sure." Her voice didn't shake. It rang with something deeper than courage, conviction. "I recorded something. It's short, but I think it matters." For a moment, the room held its breath. The board members exchanged glances, nervous, skeptical, but no one stopped her. And so she pressed play. The recording crackled to life, background noise, a door closing, muffled footsteps, and then, unmistakably, two voices. One belonged to Principal Rayburn, the other, to Mrs. Burke. Their words came casually, carelessly, never meant to be heard. "Look," Rayburn's voice said with a sigh. "I don't care what she says. That girl's been getting too much attention anyway." Then Burke responded, her voice sharper. "You know how these kids are. They always try to flip the story." And then came the sentence that dropped like a blade across the room. "Well, maybe if we push hard enough, the family will just drop it. Frankly, I don't have the energy to argue with another angry black parent." The last line didn't echo, it detonated. Gasps erupted across the audience. Someone in the back whispered, "Did they really say that?" A pen slipped from a board member's fingers and clattered to the floor. Rayburn's face flushed deep red. Mrs. Burke went pale. Angela's hand covered her mouth as if trying to catch her heartbreak midair. Kira stared in stunned silence. The board chair leaned forward, eyes locked on the recorder as though it might set fire to the desk. And Layla, she simply turned off the device, slowly, deliberately, and lifted her eyes to meet every face in that room. "I didn't plan to record them," she said quietly, "but I was there. I heard them. They didn't see me." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "My sister deserves better. We all do. And if people in charge can say things like that behind closed doors, how many other students have they already decided not to believe?" She took a step closer to the board, her voice growing stronger, each word weighted with clarity and purpose. "You heard it. That was opinion. That was intent. That was prejudice." She let it sit, let it burn, and when she spoke again, her words landed with the force of a final note in a symphony. "If we don't stand up now, then when will we?" And no one answered, because for the first time in that room, there was nothing left to say. Truth had already spoken. There was no applause, no cheering, no triumphant music to underscore the moment, only silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not the kind that comes from fear or dismissal, but the kind that settles over a room when truth has been spoken so clearly, so undeniably, that even those who wish to look away are forced to look inward. The board sat frozen, the weight of the recording pressing down like a tidal wave that had finally reached the shore. The board chair, who just moments before had spoken with smooth authority, now found his voice heavier, less polished. He cleared his throat, but the words didn't come easily. Given the new information, he began, eyes flicking toward the device as though afraid it might speak again. And the seriousness of what we've just heard. This board is moving to rescind the disciplinary action taken against Kira Johnson. Effective immediately. Around the table, there were quiet nods, not hesitant ones, but certain, unanimous. We will also initiate a formal review of the conduct of Principal Rayburn and Mrs. Burke. Until that process is complete, they will be placed on administrative leave. A soft gasp escaped Angela's lips. Not from shock, but from something closer to release, as if she'd been holding her breath for days and finally remembered how to exhale. Kira's hands flew to her face. Not to cry, but to breathe, to feel, to begin letting the weight she'd carried fall from her shoulders. And Layla stood perfectly still, notebook still in her hand, though now it hung more loosely at her side. Her voice had been quiet, her presence small, but what she had done filled every corner of that room. No one clapped, no one needed to, because the loudest sound wasn't applause. It was the moment Angela wrapped both arms around her daughters, holding them like she might never let go, pulling Kira into one arm, Layla into the other, and for the first time in weeks, they weren't defending themselves, they were simply together. Kira clung to Layla, her voice a whisper, breath warm against her sister's hair. "You saved me," she said, and this time Layla didn't shake her head or brush it off. She just nodded, eyes a little wet, heart steady. "Someone had to," she replied, not with pride, but with knowing. Outside, the light had shifted. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the pavement in golden streaks, soft and warm, like the kind of ending that doesn't need words. They didn't say much as they walked back to the car. Angela placed a hand on Layla's shoulder. Just a squeeze, just enough to say what she couldn't yet speak out loud. Kira looked at her little sister differently now, not just as the quiet girl with a notebook, but as someone who had faced a room full of doubt and tilted the entire balance with truth. And in the hush between footfalls and distant birdsong, Layla felt something shift inside her, not the heaviness of the last few weeks, but the realization that it had worked. Her voice, soft and uncertain, had reached them, not because it was loud, but because it was real, and real had been enough. As they pulled away from the school, the building grew smaller behind them, just bricks and windows and quiet hallways now, but Layla knew something had changed inside those walls. Something big, something lasting. Weeks passed, and as they always do, the headlines faded, the shock softened, and the whispers in the school hallways turned into quiet nods of recognition, some respectful, some cautious, but all acknowledging that something, or someone, had shifted the ground beneath their feet. Life resumed in the Johnson household, but it did not return to what it once was. It couldn't. Kira went back to school, but now she walked with a new kind of presence, not one forged from anger or defiance, but from a quiet awareness of what she had endured and who had stood for her. Around her, things began to move, subtly at first. Policies that had long gone unquestioned were rewritten behind closed doors. Teachers and staff who once wore their bias like invisible armor now sat through training sessions, forced to confront what had been dismissed for too long. And most importantly, for the first time in years, students, especially those with brown skin, with names mispronounced and stories misunderstood, felt like maybe, just maybe, someone was finally paying attention. Layla never told anyone how many times she replayed that day in her head, not because she wanted praise, but because part of her still needed to believe it had really happened. That she had stood up, that her voice had held the power to move adults into action. But she never bragged, never sought the spotlight. She simply returned to her books, to her quiet afternoons beneath the big oak tree near the library steps, notebook in her lap, letting the wind turn the pages when her hands were too tired. She didn't need anyone to tell her she'd made a difference. She could feel it in the way people looked at her now. with a kind of softness, a kind of respect that hadn't been there before. Then, one morning, her name came over the intercom, asking her to come to the principal's office. Not the same office, not the same voice. A new principal had arrived, Miss Carlton, whose voice was warm, handshake firm, and eyes gentle in a way that made Layla feel seen before a single word was spoken. Miss Carlton handed her a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside, nestled carefully, was a soft, leather-bound notebook, its edges gilded with gold, a satin ribbon down the center. Tucked inside was a single note, written in ink as neat as the sentiment itself. You reminded us that justice doesn't care how old you are. It only asks if you'll speak. Layla didn't say much. She didn't need to. She smiled, nodded once, and slipped the notebook into her bag like it had always belonged there. Later that week, her teacher asked her to share something with the class, anything she had learned over the last few months. She stood at the front of the room, hands tucked behind her back, heart beating steady now. No spotlight, no courtroom, just her classmates, a chalkboard, and a moment. She cleared her throat softly and said, "I didn't speak up because I'm brave." She paused, letting the quiet settle. "I spoke up because I couldn't stay quiet anymore." No one clapped. No one needed to, because sometimes, the loudest change doesn't come with a bang. It comes in the hush that follows. And sometimes, the smallest voice is the one that breaks the silence in ways no one sees coming. And no one ever forgets.